As we all know, we were once all slaves in Egypt, and we were taken out of Egypt, redeemed. But there's still a concept that when we're not in redemption terms, that we're still in a certain kind of Egypt. Now, what's Egypt to us? What brings forth Egypt? What is Egypt? Form of slavery is the primary idea. Um, Now, what did Pharaoh do? Basically, he wanted to bring about economic advances, etc. And since the Jews were already so good at advancing the economy back then, so that's what they were into. Now, what happened, kind of like in pre-Holocaust times, they adopted the German culture, German nature, etc. So did the Jews back in Egypt. Before they became slaves, they became like Egyptians, which used to say what's wrong to be like a culture. But the thing was is that they strayed from God when they knew better. So to them, and that level of judgment was a crime. They were offenders. So basically, what's Egypt to us? What's slavery to us? In the out of Egypt but still in Egypt point of view, now that we're not in redemption. For example, just like the Jews were brought into slavery in Egypt and stayed slaves of the economy, being slaves, etc., worshipping your money, for example, doing everything for the sake of money. You're already enslaving yourself. You're not free. You're controlled by it. Everything that happens all around you that affects your money is basically what you're being controlled by, and you're being a slave to it. A business, a slave to it. Now, it's different when a person is not a slave to his business, when he does it for the right means, for the right reasons, of course, godly reasons, is really what it is. It's what it represents inside, whether you know it or not. So when you do things the right way, it manifests already for God. You do things the wrong way, that's slavery. Just like slaves to a person's desires, which is lots of people's problems today. Slaves being slaves to sexuality, to seductiveness of women, basically being controlled by their sexual desires, all out of control. That leads to what? Drug type of things, heroin, cocaine, LSD, lots of things that might be unhealthy to a person and to a person's spirituality, well-being, inner freedom as well. So what's Egypt today? It's the idea of not freeing yourself completely is what it really is. So, like, for example, a person could think he's under control. He might be under control of a lot of things, or even of that situation, but is it really that person's being under control, or is it what did he choose to be like that affects everything else around him, that affects whatever he's controlling or is like or is about controlling? The only changes with it. instead of being free of it. So it can be in control of so much. This example is what many people suffer from today, which is being slaves to their egos. I'm getting in a little bit to what Egypt is in a short period of time due to different reasons. So here are some important points I'm making here. Being a slave toward your own ego, being like about the wrong things the wrong way, saying I lay my foot down, things go my way. Why? Because I once gave up to, for example, a person could say gave up to being under control of their parents instead of learning what discipline is, teaching discipline to their child or whatever. Under the wrong control, gave up his inner child, gave up himself, gave up his life, gave up all of his dreams, suddenly grew up the wrong way, and quit on himself and on the entire world, and suddenly he's like them, going the wrong path. That's a slave to his ego. When he chooses this and he wants to make everybody else like this, and he says, I'm like this, I am like this, in his own areas, what he calls himself the best at or whatever, through whatever means, and he goes by this way, is a slave. So, now the question is, what's freedom? When it comes to this area, a person who thinks to do for the right reasons, which really manifests, which really is actually what God wants for God. And so, he's choosing right or wrong. So if he chooses right, for example, he does what God wants, and he understands and sees how free it is, the freedom of it. Once you pass through all those tests that the whole world puts you through, unnecessary tests, learns not to be selfish to himself, passes all those tests, becomes viewed in respectable terms, changes, or maybe he was like that to begin with, frees himself, he's free, and now he starts to understand what freedom is. Doing things for the right reasons, the right way, frees you from all those bonds that the world has been enslaved to. Makes you free, makes you feel free, makes you happy, makes you enjoy your life. Those who are unhappy and those who are depressed especially, have been slaves to many factors, many things. Following everyone's lead without thinking, you're enslaving yourself. So what's the key idea of the Jews being slaves in Egypt? It all started with this, with things like this. Being slaves to their ego, being slaves to their desires, etc. That's where it led them to, all these vulnerabilities. To the point where they almost reached the 50th level of impurity, which called for redemption. So, when you do the right thing, when it's for God, you go against the odds, you beat the odds, whether you know it or not, whether it's fast or whether it takes time, you beat the odds, you see what freedom is, you see the sun shining up, you enjoy the breath of fresh air, freedom, and you could say to yourself within your soul, I'm free, subconsciously. It's freedom versus slavery. Who's a failure to their own conscience, which manifests the tests of God? Who fails their own conscience? Who forfeits their conscience? You forfeit your soul that way. That's a slave. So, being taken out of slavery, the Jews were redeemed. And still today, slaves of their own egos, lots of the time, which is why there's no redemption. What's a form of redemption? Making back what you lost. Maybe give you a good example. Maybe you were a good guy in boxing, for example, in the sport, famous, whatever. We'll give an example like Lennox Lewis, for example, versus Rockman. Now, Lennox Lewis, I'm sure didn't prepare for that fight. Now, when a person, let's say, cuts themselves short or doesn't do what they usually do, being the great person that they usually are, and goes the arrogant way or whatever, or goes the bad way or the evil way, whatever you want to call it. I'm not saying that it's the same thing, but goes the wrong way for themselves, to themselves, for themselves, to their conscience, knowing it's wrong. And Lennox Lewis gets taken by surprise, gets knocked out in the fight. It's over. Rockman, the new champion. When everyone knows this cat is no prized fighter, he sucks. What does Lennox do? What does Lennox Lewis do? Looks down on himself, reflects, sees what he did wrong, and he's like, man, I need to get a rematch with this guy. Everybody thinks I actually lost him legitimately somehow, as if I am not the same Lennox Lewis I once was. So he says to himself, in other words, I need redemption. He avenges that loss. He comes back up to the point where he was or where he's supposed to be. When you go to the point where he's supposed to be, especially when it's for God, when it's the right thing, there's your redemption. What do you think redemption is? Everybody earns redemption. And what happened? Lennox Lewis won. He did the best he could. And what's he known as? In the sport of boxing. Lennox Lewis, the greatest boxer in the sport of boxing of all time. That's a good example. Getting your redemption back. He took that fight seriously. He boxed the right fight. He prepared. He even over-prepared for that guy. He prepared for every fighter out there, because every fighter who's a hater was actually out to spiritually, with their means, put him down and make him lose his touch completely for losing to a unknown guy like Rockman, for example. No offense to you, Rockman. So, just to get that redemption, for one little moment of arrogance, maybe, he had to go through everyone and everything that was holding him down. Now, the example here, why am I saying this? The point is, the more you enslave yourself, the more you're a slave, the more of Egypt that you bring to your life, expect it to be a same hard way to get out, especially when you're doing this individually to yourselves in your own lives. The Jews in Egypt, they did this together. So, there might be more difficult ways of coming back up. But every Jew needs to get the Egypt out of them. Bad habits die hard. The right way for God brings redemption. Let's say a man works on himself. A quick example. He works on himself the right way. Earns his way back up to his soulmate, maybe. The right woman. Whoever. Maybe not his soulmate. Maybe she's unworthy, maybe not. Whoever. He changes himself, he gets back up, becomes such a man. Finally, he gets married, and suddenly, his whole life changed right after the moment of marriage, when he married her. Became a man who never saw himself as. Why? He was given the opportunity to go back to old ways, or to be a better man, or to choose a path that is much higher than that of what he chose, which might rectify all of his past things, mistakes or whatever, as long as he chooses to and goes that way 100%. Eventually he gets redeemed of it. So that step that he took in his life brought him redemption. One way or the other, whether it's a little bit or a lot, large in quantity, small in quantity, whatever. Welcome to redemption. What is today's Egypt? When it's not for the right thing, it's anti-redemption. What is today's Egypt? That was for the Jews back then when they were back in Egypt, which out of Egypt marks what? When there's no redemption, not a redeemed atmosphere, you could say. What is today's Egypt? When you're a slave. Anti-redemption is what it is. To redemption,